Daughter of millionaires secretly marries poor man. Upon revealing the reason, everyone was shocked. Get ready for a journey full of nostalgia and incredible twists. Today's story is truly remarkable, with an ending that's sure to touch your heart and leave you amazed. So, stay with me until the very last moment. I hope this experience is unforgettable for you, and may God bless you and your family. Now, let's get started. In the summer of 1983, Elizabeth Montgomery stepped out onto the balcony of her family's sprawling Connecticut estate, her evening gown rustling in the warm breeze. At 22, she was the sole heiress to the Montgomery fortune, yet wealth had never filled the emptiness she felt inside. Below, in the meticulously maintained gardens, she noticed a new gardener working among the roses. Thomas Parker wiped the sweat from his brow as he carefully pruned the prized rose bushes. At 24, he had taken the gardening position at the Montgomery estate to help support his younger siblings after their parents' passing. He had no idea that accepting this job would change his life forever. Elizabeth found herself drawn to the garden more frequently, watching Thomas work with such dedication and care. Unlike the privileged young men her parents paraded before her at countless society events, Thomas possessed a quiet dignity that fascinated her. His gentle way with the plants spoke of a sensitivity that wealth couldn't buy. Their first conversation happened over a wounded bird. Elizabeth had found it near the fountain, and Thomas knew exactly how to help, fashioning a small splint from garden twine and popsicle sticks. His careful hands and kind eyes made Elizabeth's heart flutter in a way she'd never experienced before. "And my father would never approve," Elizabeth confided to her childhood nanny, Margaret, one evening. The older woman had practically raised Elizabeth and was the only one who truly understood her. "Your father disapproves of most things that bring you joy, dear," Margaret replied, her wise eyes twinkling. "But sometimes the heart knows better than society's rules." As summer progressed, Elizabeth and Thomas found more reasons to cross paths in the garden. Their conversations, though brief, revealed a deep connection. Thomas shared stories of his siblings, Mike, 14, and Sarah, 12, and how he'd taken on their care after losing their parents in a car accident. Elizabeth spoke of her lonely childhood in the massive estate, surrounded by wealth but starved for genuine affection. The Montgomery estate buzzed with preparation for Elizabeth's upcoming engagement party. Her father, William Montgomery, had arranged for her to marry James Whitney III, heir to a banking fortune. The marriage would merge two of New England's most prestigious families, but Elizabeth felt nothing for James beyond polite tolerance. "The announcement will be made at your birthday gala next month," William declared over dinner one evening, not bothering to ask Elizabeth's opinion. "The Whitneys are excellent people, and James will make a suitable husband." Elizabeth sat silent, pushing food around her plate, while her mother Victoria sipped wine and spoke enthusiastically about wedding plans. Neither parent noticed the tears threatening to spill from their daughter's eyes. Later that night, Elizabeth fled to the garden, seeking solace among the roses she'd come to associate with Thomas. To her surprise, he was there, working late to prepare for an upcoming garden party. "Miss Montgomery?" His voice was soft with concern. "Are you all right?" "Please," she whispered, "call me Elizabeth." That moment marked a turning point. In the shadows of the garden, surrounded by the sweet scent of roses, Elizabeth and Thomas began sharing more than just casual conversations. They shared their dreams, their fears, and their growing feelings for each other. However, their blossoming connection didn't go unnoticed. Bradley Cooper, the estate's security chief, had been watching Thomas with increasing suspicion. He'd seen too many fortune hunters in his years of service to the Montgomery family. "That gardener's been spending an awful lot of time around Miss Elizabeth," Bradley reported to William Montgomery. "Perhaps we should consider finding a replacement." William frowned, his face darkening with concern. "Keep an eye on him, Bradley. I won't have some penniless opportunist taking advantage of my daughter." As summer drew to a close, Elizabeth and Thomas realized their feelings had grown too deep to deny, but the walls of social class and family expectations loomed higher than ever. They knew they would have to make a choice, one that would either break their hearts or change their lives forever. Elizabeth stood at her bedroom window one evening, watching Thomas leave for the day. Her birthday gala was approaching, and with it, The dreaded engagement announcement. She touched the glass, her fingers tracing Thomas's distant figure, knowing she faced the most important decision of her life. What no one yet realized was that Elizabeth had inherited more than just her father's fortune. She'd inherited her grandmother's fierce determination and secret rebellious streak, and she was about to prove it in a way that would shock everyone. The late summer of 1983 brought more than just changing leaves to the Montgomery estate. Elizabeth found herself caught in an increasingly complex web of obligations and hidden feelings. Each morning, she would wake to the sound of her mother Victoria planning elaborate details for both her upcoming birthday gala and the dreaded engagement announcement to James Whitney III. The engagement ring, a massive diamond that felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love, sat untouched in its blue velvet box on her vanity. James had presented it to her during a formal dinner, with both families present, though the official announcement was still weeks away. Elizabeth remembered how his hands had been cold when he slipped it on her finger for the obligatory photographs, how his smile never reached his eyes. Thomas noticed its absence from her hand one morning as she walked through the garden, pretending to inspect the late-blooming dahlias. He said nothing, but his eyes held a question he dared not ask. Instead, he showed her a family of cardinals nesting in one of the oak trees, their red feathers bright against the deepening autumn leaves. "Sarah loves birds," he said, speaking of his younger sister. "Yes, she keeps a journal of every species she spots from our apartment window." The mention of his modest home made him self-conscious, but Elizabeth moved closer, eager to hear more. "Tell me about your home, Thomas," she asked, settling onto a stone bench. "What's it like?" Thomas hesitated, then sat at the far end of the bench. "It's small," he admitted. 2 bedrooms in an old building downtown. The radiator clanks all winter, and the neighbor's cat somehow finds its way onto our fire escape no matter what we do. But it's home. Mike and Sarah have their own room, and I take the pull-out couch in the living room. Elizabeth closed her eyes, imagining a home filled with love rather than antiques. It sounds wonderful. Their conversations grew longer, more intimate, though they were careful to maintain the appearance of propriety. Thomas would work on the gardens while Elizabeth sat nearby, supposedly reading but actually listening, as he shared stories about his siblings. She learned how Mike was teaching himself guitar on a second-hand instrument, dreaming of being the next Eddie Van Halen, how Sarah had won her school spelling bee and wanted to become a veterinarian. Meanwhile, the pressure from her family mounted. James Whitney III began making unexpected visits to the estate, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits that seemed at odds with his youth. He spoke constantly of their future together, the house they would build, the social circles they would dominate, the perfect life they would lead. "I've already discussed it with your father," James announced during one such visit, not noticing how Elizabeth stiffened at his words. "We'll build a house in Greenwich, something suitable for entertaining. The architect's drawings should be ready next week." Elizabeth felt suffocated by these plans being made without her input. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful lunch with James and her mother, she fled to the greenhouse. Thomas found her there, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she whispered, forgetting for a moment the social barriers between them. "I can't marry him." Thomas stood frozen, torn between his heart's desire to comfort her and his awareness of their different stations in life. But when Elizabeth's shoulders began to shake with silent sobs, he couldn't stop himself from moving closer. "Elizabeth," he said softly, offering her his handkerchief, clean but worn thin from many washings. The simple cotton stood in stark contrast to the silk-embroidered ones she usually carried, but she took it gratefully. "They've planned my entire life," she continued, wiping her eyes. "The right schools, the right friends, the right husband. But none of it feels right to me. Do you know what James said today? He said we wouldn't need this garden after we're married, that we could hire people to bring in fresh flowers." Thomas looked around the greenhouse he'd helped tend for months, at the riot of colors and life he carefully maintained. "Some people don't understand that a garden is more than just flowers," he said quietly. "It's about nurturing something, watching it grow. You can't just buy that." Their eyes met, and in that moment, both felt the weight of words unspoken between them. Elizabeth reached out, almost touching his hand, then pulled back as voices approached the greenhouse. Bradley Cooper's heavy footsteps could be heard on the gravel path outside. Thomas quickly moved to the potting bench, picking up his tools as Elizabeth straightened her dress and tried to compose herself. The security chief entered, his suspicious gaze taking in the scene. "Miss Montgomery, your mother's looking for you. Something about place cards for the gala." Elizabeth nodded, turning to leave. At the door, she paused. "Thank you for checking on the orchids, Thomas. They're my grandmother's favorites." That evening, Elizabeth sat at her desk pulling out her grandmother's old diary, a secret treasure she'd discovered in the library years ago. Eleanor Montgomery had been a force of nature in her time, defying her own parents to marry a man they deemed unsuitable. William Montgomery rarely spoke of how his parents' marriage had scandalized society, preferring to embrace the respectability his father's later business success had brought. Elizabeth ran her fingers over her grandmother's elegant handwriting. Love, real love, comes rarely enough in this world. To turn away from it for the sake of society's approval is to turn away from life itself. As September wore on, the estate began its transformation for Elizabeth's birthday gala. Tents appeared on the lawn, and crews arrived to string thousands of lights through the trees. Elizabeth watched from her window as Thomas and the other gardeners created elaborate floral arrangements, her heart aching at the thought of the announcement that would be made under those lights. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Elizabeth made her way to the garden's hidden corner where she knew Thomas worked late. He was alone, carefully wrapping burlap around delicate plants to protect them from the coming frost. "Thomas," she said softly, causing him to turn, "I need to tell you something." He straightened, his face guarded but his eyes hopeful. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating a private world just for them. "I've made a decision," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger. "I won't marry James. I can't." Thomas remained silent, though his hands gripped the burlap tighter. Elizabeth stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd once told her about. "My grandmother left me something when she died. Something besides her love of gardens. She left me a trust fund in my name, one my father doesn't control. I've never told anyone about it because I never had a reason to think about independence before." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Thomas finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Elizabeth, I have nothing to offer you except what's real," she finished for him. "That's all I want. That's all I've ever wanted." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, causing them to step apart. Bradley Cooper emerged from the shadows, his flashlight beam cutting through the gathering dusk. "Miss Montgomery, your father's asking for you." "The wedding planner's here to discuss the gala." Elizabeth nodded, composing herself. "Thank you, Bradley. I'll be right there." She turned to Thomas, her voice formal again. "Please make sure the roses are well protected from the frost. They're so special to this garden." As she walked away, Bradley lingered, his suspicious gaze fixed on Thomas. "Getting mighty dark out here," he said pointedly. "Best finish up and head home." Thomas nodded, returning to his work. But his mind was racing with possibilities he'd never dared consider before. In the growing darkness, he failed to notice Bradley Cooper watching him from the shadows, making notes in a small book he carried. The gala was now just 2 weeks away, and with it, the announcement that would change everything, though not in the way anyone expected. Elizabeth had set her plan in motion, but the biggest challenges still lay ahead, and the price of following her heart would be higher than she imagined. The autumn chill settled over Connecticut as October 1983 painted the Montgomery estate in brilliant shades of red and gold. With just 10 days until Elizabeth's birthday gala, tension filled the mansion like an approaching storm. Victoria Montgomery fluttered through the halls with clipboards and catalogues, obsessing over every detail of what she called the social event of the season. Elizabeth found herself trapped in an endless parade of fittings and meetings. Her gala dress, a creation of ivory silk and pearls, hung like a ghost in her closet. The engagement ring from James Whitney III remained in its box, only worn during official photographs or family dinners. Her mother had started to notice its absence. "Darling, you simply must wear it," Victoria insisted one morning, fixing Elizabeth with a critical eye. "People are beginning to talk. The Whitneys are getting concerned." "Let them talk," Elizabeth replied, her grandmother's quiet strength flowing through her veins. "The ring doesn't fit properly. I'm having it resized." The lie came easily now, practiced over countless dinners and society functions. That same morning, Thomas received unexpected news that would complicate everything. His supervisor, Frank, he called him into the estate's maintenance office, a converted garden shed that smelled of fertilizer and old coffee. "Got a problem, Parker," Frank said, shuffling through some papers. "Bradley Cooper's been asking questions. Says you're spending too much time around the main house, especially when Miss Montgomery's in the garden." Thomas kept his face carefully neutral. "I'm just doing my job, Frank. The roses need constant attention this time of year." "Maybe so," Frank sighed. "But Cooper's got the ear of Mr. Montgomery. Listen, you're a good worker, Thomas. Best gardener we've had in years. But this job supports your siblings, right? Don't do anything foolish." The warning weighed heavily on Thomas as he worked that afternoon, carefully preparing the garden for the upcoming gala. He knew Frank was right. This job meant everything for Mike and Sarah's future. Yet every time he saw Elizabeth, even from a distance, his heart reminded him that some things were worth risking everything for. Elizabeth had her own challenges. James had become increasingly possessive, showing up unannounced at the estate with plans and demands. That afternoon, he arrived in his new BMW, bringing samples of expensive wallpaper for their future home. "The architect suggests French provincial style," he declared, spreading the samples across the library table. "Of course, we'll need to hire all new staff. Can't have these country servants in our Greenwich house." Elizabeth thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands that could coax life from the earth itself. "I like our staff here," she said quietly. "They're part of what makes this place home." James laughed, the sound hollow and condescending. "Oh, darling, you can't be sentimental about servants. Besides, you'll be too busy with charity boards and social committees to worry about domestic staff." His words painted a picture of Elizabeth's future that made her feel physically ill. Excusing herself, she fled to her sanctuary, the greenhouse where Thomas worked. But Bradley Cooper intercepted her before she could reach the door. "Miss Montgomery," he said, his voice professionally stern. "Hi, your father asked me to remind you about the photographer coming this afternoon for the engagement portraits." Elizabeth felt trapped, knowing her father's security chief was watching her every move. "Thank you, Bradley. I'll be there shortly." Through the greenhouse glass, she could see Thomas working, his movements precise and careful as he tended to the flowers that would decorate her birthday gala. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, she drew strength from his steady gaze. That evening, Elizabeth made a crucial decision. After dinner, she visited her old nanny Margaret in the staff quarters, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I need your help, Margaret," Elizabeth said, carefully closing the door. "You're the only one I can trust." Margaret, who had dried Elizabeth's tears and bandaged her scraped knees throughout childhood, sat down heavily in her worn armchair. "What are you planning, child?" Elizabeth unwrapped the package, revealing her grandmother Eleanor's diary and a stack of legal papers. "I need you to keep these safe for me. And I need you to help me with something else. Something that has to remain absolutely secret." As Elizabeth explained her plan, Margaret's eyes widened. "Child, are you sure? Your father will be furious." "I've never been more sure of anything," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady. "Grandmother Eleanor would understand. She did the same thing, didn't she? That's why father never speaks of how his parents met." Margaret nodded slowly, memories of a younger Eleanor Montgomery dancing in her eyes. She was braver than anyone knew, and so are you, my dear. Unknown to them, Bradley Cooper had seen Elizabeth entering Margaret's room. His suspicions growing, he made a phone call to William Montgomery's private line. The next morning, Thomas arrived at work to find his small office in the greenhouse had been searched. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. He was being watched. Later that day, he overheard two maids gossiping about Elizabeth's engagement photos, scheduled to appear in the Sunday paper. "They make such a handsome couple," one maid sighed, "like something from a magazine." Thomas forced himself to continue working, though each snip of his pruning shears felt like a cut to his own heart. He had almost convinced himself to give up hope when a folded note appeared among his tools, delivered by Sarah during her after-school visit to the estate. "Someone asked me to give this to you," Sarah said with a conspiratorial smile. "A nice lady who used to be a nanny here." The note, written in Elizabeth's elegant hand, contained just 3 words: "Trust in me." That night, as darkness fell over the Montgomery estate, multiple plans were set in motion. Bradley Cooper compiled a detailed report for William Montgomery. James Whitney III finalized arrangements for the house in Greenwich, and in her room, Elizabeth Montgomery began carefully packing a small suitcase, hiding it beneath her ball gowns. The birthday gala was now just days away, and no one, not William Montgomery, not James Whitney III, not even Bradley Cooper, suspected just how dramatically their carefully ordered world was about to change. But storm clouds were gathering, and the biggest shocks were yet to come. As Elizabeth stood at her window that night, watching Thomas's distant figure leave the estate, she touched the glass and whispered a promise to herself and to him. In her pocket, she held 2 bus tickets to Vermont, purchased under a different name. Everything was ready. All she needed now was courage and perfect timing. But Bradley Cooper was closing in on their secret, and James Whitney III was about to reveal a side of himself that would change everything. The next few days would test not only Elizabeth and Thomas's love, but also their very understanding of what they were willing to risk for a chance at happiness. The week before Elizabeth Montgomery's birthday gala brought unexpected revelations that shook the very foundation of her carefully laid plans. An unusually warm October morning found her in the estate's library, searching through old newspapers her grandmother Eleanor had preserved, when she discovered something that made her blood run cold. There, in a yellowed society page from 1957, was a photograph of a much younger James Whitney II, her fiancé's father, standing beside her mother, Victoria. The caption revealed they had once been engaged, but the marriage never took place. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she read further, discovering that Victoria had broken the engagement abruptly, marrying William Montgomery just months later. This explained the strange tension she'd always sensed between her mother and James's family. The forced smiles at social gatherings, the overly formal politeness. Was this why her parents were so insistent on her marriage to James III? Some sort of decades-old attempt at making amends. Her discovery was interrupted by raised voices from her father's study across the hall. Elizabeth moved closer to the partially open door, recognizing James's voice, unusually angry and sharp. "Your daughter is becoming a problem," James was saying, his cultivated charm completely absent. "I've had Bradley Cooper following her. She's been spending far too much time with that gardener." William Montgomery's response was cold. "The situation is under control. Elizabeth will do what's expected of her. She understands her responsibilities to this family." "She better," James replied, "because this merger between our companies depends on this marriage. My father hasn't forgotten how your wife humiliated him. This is our chance to finally join the families and secure both our futures." Elizabeth backed away from the door, her mind reeling. So that was the truth. Her marriage to James wasn't about love or even social standing. It was a business transaction, a corporate merger sealed with a wedding ring. Later that afternoon, Thomas was working near the greenhouse when Sarah arrived for her usual after-school visit. But today, his sister's face was streaked with tears. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "They're shutting off our heat," Sarah sobbed. "Mike tried to hide the notice, but I found it. We can't afford the bills, can we?" Thomas pulled his sister close, his heart heavy. The truth was, even with his job at the estate, they were barely making ends meet. Winter was coming, and their apartment's ancient heating system consumed expensive fuel oil. "Don't worry," he assured her, though worry was exactly what he was doing. "I'll figure something out." What Thomas didn't know was that Bradley Cooper had witnessed this exchange. The security chief smiled grimly as he added this information to his growing file. A desperate man in need of money, it was exactly what he needed to prove his theory about Thomas's intentions toward Elizabeth. That evening, Elizabeth made her way to the greenhouse, needing to warn Thomas about what she'd overheard. But she found James waiting instead, his handsome face twisted with barely contained anger. "Looking for your gardener?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "How utterly disappointing, Elizabeth. Though I suppose I should thank him. He's helped me see exactly what kind of woman you really are." Elizabeth straightened her spine, channeling her grandmother's strength. "And what kind of man are you, James? One who arranges marriages for business deals?" His face darkened. "You heard that, did you? Well, good. Maybe now you'll understand what's really at stake here. This isn't some romantic fairy tale. This is business, Elizabeth. Your father's company needs this merger, and my family needs the Montgomery name to restore what your mother destroyed." "I won't do it," Elizabeth declared. "I won't marry you." James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you will. Because if you don't, I'll make sure your gardener friend never works again. Not just here, anywhere. One phone call from me, and his siblings will be out on the street. Is that what you want?" Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. James stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "That's right. Bradley Cooper has been very thorough in his investigation. Poor Thomas Parker, raising his siblings alone, barely making ends meet. It would be a shame if something happened to jeopardize their situation." Before Elizabeth could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. James quickly stepped back, his public mask sliding seamlessly back into place as one of the maids entered the greenhouse. Elizabeth fled to her room, her mind racing. James's threat changed everything. Her carefully laid plans now seemed selfish and dangerous, not just to her, but to Thomas and his innocent siblings. That night, she wrote 2 letters. The first was to Margaret Yee, explaining everything and including a crucial request. The second was to Thomas, her hands shaking as she penned the words that would break both their hearts. Meanwhile, Bradley Cooper sat in his small office, reviewing his notes one final time before making his report to William Montgomery. But something wasn't adding up. As he reread the financial documents he'd gathered on Thomas Parker, a discrepancy caught his eye. He began digging deeper, and what he discovered would change the course of events in ways no one could predict. As midnight approached, Thomas received an urgent message from Margaret, delivered by one of the younger gardeners. The note contained just 4 words: "The roses need you." It was their secret code, meaning Elizabeth needed to see him urgently. Thomas hurried to their meeting spot behind the greenhouse, his heart pounding. But instead of Elizabeth, he found Bradley Cooper waiting in the shadows. "Mr. Parker," the security chief said grimly, "I think it's time you and I had a serious conversation about exactly what's going on here." The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of approaching rain. In her room, Elizabeth stared at the engagement ring she'd finally put on, each diamond catching the lamplight like frozen tears. The gala was just 3 days away, and time was running out for everyone. But the biggest shock was still to come, a truth that would turn everyone's plans upside down and force them all to question everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the true nature of wealth. The night air grew colder as Thomas faced Bradley Cooper in the shadow of the greenhouse. The security chief's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the growing concern on Thomas's face. "You know why I'm here," Bradley said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But I don't think I know the whole story. Show me what's in your jacket pocket." Thomas tensed. In his pocket was Elizabeth's letter, delivered by Margaret just hours ago. He hadn't even had a chance to read it yet. "Mr. Cooper, The truth, son. It's time for the truth." With reluctant fingers, Thomas withdrew the envelope. Before he could protest, Bradley had opened it and begun reading by flashlight. His expression changed as he read, eyebrows rising in surprise. "Well," Bradley said finally, "this changes things." He carefully refolded the letter and handed it back. "Read it. You need to know what she wrote." Under Bradley's watchful eye, Thomas read Elizabeth's words. "My dearest Thomas, by the time you read this, you'll have heard about my engagement to James. What you don't know is that he's threatening to destroy your family if I don't go through with the wedding. I can't let that happen. Your siblings need you, and I won't be the cause of their suffering. But there's something else you need to know, something I discovered in my grandmother's papers. The trust fund I told you about. It's much more than just money. My grandmother Eleanor left specific instructions about the Montgomery estate, instructions that could change everything. I'm telling you this because I trust you, and because Bradley Cooper isn't who we thought he was. Show him this letter. He knew my grandmother, and he's the only one who can help us now. All my love, Elizabeth. Thomas looked up at Bradley in confusion. The security chief sighed, holstering his flashlight. Your grandmother, he said quietly. Eleanor Montgomery was more than just the family matriarch. She was a brilliant businesswoman who built half of what the Montgomery fortune is today, and she never trusted her son-in-law, William. What does this have to do with Elizabeth? Thomas asked. Everything. Bradley pulled a folded document from his coat. I've been investigating for months not to stop you and Elizabeth, but to protect her. Eleanor left specific conditions in her will, conditions that William Montgomery has kept hidden from Elizabeth. Inside the greenhouse, Bradley spread the documents on a workbench. In the dim light, Thomas read words that made his heart race. Elizabeth's inheritance wasn't just a trust fund. It was controlling interest in Montgomery Industries itself, but only if she married for love before her 23rd birthday. William's been desperate to arrange this marriage to James before Elizabeth's birthday, Bradley explained. Once she turns 23, she gains full control of her grandmother's shares. The merger he's planning with the Whitneys would be impossible without Elizabeth's cooperation. So all this time, I've been watching, gathering evidence. Eleanor asked me to protect Elizabeth before she died. I was more than just the family's security chief. I was Eleanor's most trusted advisor. Meanwhile, in the main house, Elizabeth sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The engagement ring felt like a shackle on her finger. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Come in, she called, expecting her mother. Instead, Margaret entered, carrying a small wooden box. It's time you had this, the old nanny said, placing the box on the vanity. Your grandmother left it with me, to give to you when the moment was right. Elizabeth opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was another letter and a single key. My dearest Elizabeth, her grandmother's letter began. If you're reading this, you've found yourself at a crossroads between love and duty. The key enclosed opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank. What you find there will give you the strength to choose your own path, just as I did so many years ago. Margaret, Elizabeth whispered, did you know about this? I've kept many secrets for your grandmother, Margaret smiled, and now it's time for them all to come to light. Back in the greenhouse, Bradley was sharing more revelations with Thomas. Your parents on accident, Bradley said carefully. It wasn't as simple as you've been told. Thomas felt his world tilt. What do you mean? They were investigating corporate fraud, specifically involving James Whitney II and his connections to organized crime. Your father was an investigative reporter. Your mother, a legal aid attorney. They were getting close to exposing something big. Thomas sat heavily on a nearby stool, memories of his parents flooding back. The accident was no accident, but we could never prove it. Eleanor Montgomery was helping them, secretly funding their investigation. That's why she set up the trust fund the way she did. She knew the Whitneys would eventually try to take control of Montgomery Industries. Does Elizabeth know any of this? Not yet, but she needs to know before the gala. Everything depends on what happens in the next 48 hours. As dawn approached, Elizabeth made her way to the garden, unable to sleep. She found Thomas waiting by the roses, his face etched with concern and newfound understanding. Bradley told me everything, he said softly. And I found my grandmother's letter, Elizabeth replied. But Thomas, James's threats, won't matter once the truth comes out. Bradley has a plan, but we'll need your courage, the kind of courage your grandmother had. Elizabeth looked at the roses her grandmother had planted so many years ago, their late blooms defying the autumn chill. In that moment, she felt Eleanor's strength flowing through her veins. Then we'll need to act fast, she said. The gala is tomorrow night, and James won't give up easily. What none of them realized was that James Whitney III was at that very moment making a desperate phone call to his father, setting in motion events that would bring shocking revelations to light during the gala itself. As the sun rose over the Montgomery estate, the staff began final preparations for the party. Florists arrived with fresh flowers, caterers bustled in the kitchen, and somewhere in the city, a safe deposit box waited to reveal secrets that would change everything. October 15, 1983, dawned crisp and clear. The Montgomery estate buzzed with activity as an army of workers transformed the grounds for Elizabeth's birthday gala. Crystal chandeliers hung from the party tent, their prisms catching the autumn sunlight. White roses, Eleanor's favorites, adorned every table. Elizabeth stood at her bedroom window, watching the preparations below. The safe deposit box key felt heavy in her palm. Earlier that morning, she had visited First National Bank with Bradley Cooper as escort, retrieving a thick envelope that now lay sealed on her desk. She hadn't opened it yet, wanting to wait for the right moment. In the servants' quarters, Thomas prepared for his role in Bradley's plan. The security chief had given him specific instructions, timing that had to be perfect. His siblings, Mike and Sarah, were safely away at their aunt's house in New Hampshire, Bradley's idea, in case James tried to make good on his threats. Victoria Montgomery fluttered through the mansion, directing staff and making last-minute adjustments. Everything must be perfect, she kept saying, though her hands shook slightly whenever she checked her watch. She hadn't told anyone about the late-night phone call from James Whitney II, or the veiled threats he'd made about exposing old secrets. By late afternoon, guests began arriving. Connecticut's oldest families streamed up the torch-lit driveway in expensive cars, bearing gifts and barely concealed curiosity. Everyone had heard rumors about the impending engagement announcement, and no one wanted to miss what promised to be the social event of the season. Elizabeth dressed slowly in her room, receiving no visitors except Margaret, who helped her with the ivory silk gown. The old nanny's eyes were knowing as she fastened the pearls around Elizabeth's neck, Eleanor's pearls, passed down through generations. "Your grandmother wore these the night she defied her own parents," Margaret said softly. "She would be so proud of you." Downstairs, William Montgomery greeted James Whitney III and his parents in the library. James looked confident in his tuxedo, but his father's face was tense. They spoke in low voices about the merger, about plans that seemed so solid just days ago, but now felt increasingly uncertain. "Everything is arranged?" William asked, swirling bourbon in his crystal glass. "Of course," James replied smoothly. "By tomorrow morning the papers will be signed, and the merger will be unstoppable." What they didn't know was that Bradley Cooper stood just outside the library door, recording their entire conversation on a small tape recorder hidden in his jacket, the same kind Elizabeth's father had used years ago. The gala began at 7. Elizabeth made her entrance down the grand staircase to appreciative murmurs from the assembled guests. She wore her engagement ring, its diamonds flashing under the chandeliers, but observant guests noticed it was on her right hand, not her left. James immediately claimed her for the first dance, his grip on her waist slightly too tight. "You look lovely, darling," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Then, in a whisper, "Don't even think about trying anything. I have men watching your gardener's siblings right now." Elizabeth's smile never wavered, though her heart raced. "You really should check your sources more carefully, James," she replied softly. "Bradley Cooper is very good at his job." For the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker in James's eyes. The evening progressed according to plan. Champagne flowed, music played, and guests danced beneath the stars. At precisely 9 o'clock, William Montgomery clinked his glass for attention, preparing to make the engagement announcement. But before he could speak, Bradley Cooper appeared at Elizabeth's side. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir," he said formally, "but there's an urgent call from the New York office. Something about irregular stock transfers." William's face paled slightly. James Whitney II stepped forward, his own expression darkening. "What stock transfers?" "The ones you've been making illegally for the past month," came a new voice. Eleanor Wright, the Montgomery family's longtime lawyer, emerged from the crowd holding a thick folder. Or should we discuss the real reason behind this rushed engagement? Murmurs rippled through the guests. Elizabeth felt James's grip on her arm tighten painfully, then release as Bradley smoothly stepped between them. "I don't know what you're talking about," William Montgomery blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I think you do, Dad," Elizabeth said clearly, removing her engagement ring completely. "Grandmother Eleanor left very specific instructions in her will, instructions you chose to ignore." She opened the envelope from the safe deposit box, removing several documents. "As of midnight tonight, my 23rd birthday, I inherit controlling interest in Montgomery Industries. Any merger would require my approval, which I do not give." James lunged forward, his carefully cultivated charm cracking completely. "You stupid girl, do you have any idea what's at stake here?" "I do," Elizabeth replied calmly. "I know everything. About the fraud investigation my grandmother was funding. About Thomas's parents and their accident. Bradley has been gathering evidence for months." The color drained from James Whitney II's face. His son looked between them in confusion, suddenly realizing he might not know the whole story himself. "That's right," Bradley stepped forward. "Eleanor Montgomery suspected you were involved in the deaths of John and Mary Parker. She spent years gathering evidence, which she left in trust for their children, specifically for Thomas Parker, who she hired personally to tend her roses." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thomas emerged from the shadows where he'd been waiting, wearing a suit Bradley had provided. He looked nothing like a gardener now, but rather every inch his father's son, the crusading journalist who had died seeking truth. "You killed my parents," Thomas said quietly, facing James Whitney Tex. "And now we can prove it." The next few minutes were chaos. James Whitney Thas tried to flee, but was stopped by police officers Bradley had stationed discreetly around the perimeter. James III stood frozen, his world crumbling as he learned the true nature of his family's business dealings. Victoria Montgomery had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. William Montgomery looked old suddenly, the weight of his choices evident in his stance, but Elizabeth hardly noticed. She was looking at Thomas, seeing in his face the same mixture of relief, vindication, and lingering sadness that she felt herself. They had won, but the victory came with revelations that would change all their lives forever. The gala guests departed quickly, sensing that they had witnessed something far more momentous than a simple engagement announcement. Tomorrow, the newspapers would be full of scandal, but tonight, in the aftermath of truth, there was only silence. Elizabeth found herself in the garden, among her grandmother's roses. Thomas joined her there, as he had so many times before. But now, everything was different. Now they were free. Yet even as they stood together in the moonlight, both knew that the night's revelations were not quite complete. There was one final truth to be told, one last secret that would tie everything together. The morning after the gala, sunlight crept across the Montgomery estate, illuminating the aftermath of the previous night's revelations. Empty champagne glasses and wilted flower arrangements stood as silent witnesses to how quickly life could change. In the garden, the roses still bloomed, oblivious to the upheaval their secret keeper had helped unveil. Elizabeth sat in the library with Margaret, Bradley Cooper, and Eleanor Wright, the family lawyer. The grandfather clock ticked steadily as Eleanor opened her briefcase, removing one final document. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this last letter on your 23rd birthday," Eleanor said, handling the envelope with reverence. She was very specific about the timing. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The paper inside held her grandmother's familiar, elegant script. "My dearest Elizabeth, by now, the truth about the Whitneys has come to light. Bradley has done his duty, as he promised me he would. But there's one last secret to share, perhaps the most important one of all. You see, my darling, I didn't just hire Thomas Parker to tend the roses. I hired him because I knew exactly who he was. His father, John Parker, wasn't just investigating the Whitneys' corruption. He was my son, your uncle. Yes, Elizabeth. Thomas is your cousin, though distantly enough that your feelings for each other need never be troubled by this knowledge. I gave John up for adoption during the war when I was young and alone. When I finally found him years later, he was already a crusading journalist, married to the brilliant lawyer Mary Chen. They never knew I was his mother. I chose to help them secretly instead, funding their investigation through channels they never traced back to me. When they died, I knew the Whitneys were responsible. though I couldn't prove it then. I vowed to protect their children and bring justice to our family. Thomas and his siblings have their own trust fund waiting for them. I made sure they would be taken care of, though I had to wait to reveal everything until you were old enough to take control of the company. Your father doesn't know any of this. I never told him about the baby I gave up, or that John Parker was his half-brother. Perhaps now he'll understand why I was so insistent about the terms of your inheritance. Love, my darling girl, is worth fighting for in all its forms. Family, romance, justice. I fought for all three in my own way. Now it's your turn to decide what to do with the truth. All my love, Grandmother Eleanor. Elizabeth looked up, tears streaming down her face. Margaret was crying too, nodding slowly. I was there, the old nanny said softly. I helped your grandmother find John years later. I knew Thomas looked familiar the moment he arrived to tend the gardens. He has Eleanor's eyes. Bradley cleared his throat, his usual professional demeanor softened by emotion. That's why I've been watching over both of you. Eleanor made me promise to protect her whole family, not just the Montgomerys, but the Parkers too. A knock at the library door made them all turn. Thomas stood there, still wearing last night's suit, his face showing signs of a sleepless night. I thought I might find you here, he said to Elizabeth. The police have taken formal statements from the Whitneys. James II has confessed to everything, trying to get a lighter sentence. His son, James III, has agreed to testify against him. Elizabeth rose, moving toward him. Thomas, there's something you need to know. She handed him Eleanor's letter. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something like wonder. All this time, he whispered, she was watching over us, wasn't she? She was, Bradley confirmed. Your trust fund is substantial, Thomas. You and your siblings will never have to worry about money again. Thomas shook his head slowly. It was never about the money. I just wanted to know why my parents died, why no one seemed to care about finding the truth. And now we know, Elizabeth finished for him. And we can honor their legacy, all of them. My grandmother, your parents, they fought for truth and justice until the very end. In the days that followed, the story broke in every newspaper. The Whitney scandal rocked Connecticut society. William Montgomery stepped down as CEO, letting Elizabeth take control of the company as her grandmother had intended. His own part in hiding the truth cost him his marriage. Victoria finally found the courage to leave him, starting fresh on her own terms. Thomas used part of his inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in his parents' names, supporting young journalists and lawyers dedicated to investigating corporate corruption. His siblings, Mike and Sarah, could finally pursue their own dreams, music and veterinary school, respectively. The Montgomery estate remained Elizabeth's home, but she transformed it into something new. The gardens, under Thomas's continued care, became a public space where everyone was welcome. The greenhouse hosted educational programs for local schools. Even the mansion itself felt lighter, airier, with windows thrown open to the future. One crisp morning in late autumn, Elizabeth stood among the roses with Thomas, both of them reading the dedication plaque for the new Eleanor Montgomery Memorial Gardens. She would have loved this, Thomas said, touching a bloom gently. Using her legacy to bring beauty and truth to light, Elizabeth smiled, thinking of all her grandmother's secrets, now finally revealed. She taught us that love comes in many forms, she said. Love of family, love of justice, love of gardening, Thomas added with a small smile. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. And she taught us that the greatest love stories aren't always what they seem. Sometimes they're about finding your way home, even if you didn't know that's what you were looking for. As if to prove her point, Margaret appeared on the garden path, carrying a tray with 3 cups of tea, a new tradition for their morning garden meetings. Behind her, Mike practiced guitar on the terrace while Sarah sat nearby, sketching birds in her new journal. They had become a different kind of family, bound together by Eleanor's love and sacrifice. The roses bloomed around them, late and lovely in the autumn light, keeping watch over their legacy of truth, justice, and love. The Montgomery estate would never again be a place of secrets and pain. Instead, it had become a sanctuary where love in all its forms could flourish openly, much like the roses Eleanor had planted so many years ago, roots deep, blooms reaching toward the sun, growing stronger with each passing season. And in the end, that was the greatest wedding gift Eleanor could have given them all, the freedom to love truly, honestly, and without fear. Elizabeth and Thomas exchanged a glance, their shared history and future stretching out before them like the garden paths. The mystery had been solved, justice had been served, and love, in all its complex, beautiful forms, had prevailed. The roses nodded in the autumn breeze, their petals catching the light like diamonds, but far more precious than any ring could ever be. Thank you for watching today's story. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to relive the magic of the 80s every day with our heartfelt stories. May God bless you and your family, and don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another totally rad story you won't want to miss. See you in the next video, and stay awesome.